Coming up, what were the biggest surprises on the Nets Summer League roster, and what should fans be watching for in Las Vegas? I'll answer that after this.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And on today's show, I'm going to be reacting to the Nets Summer League roster release and outlining what fans should be watching for during the team's games in Las Vegas. The Nets released their Summer League roster on Saturday. The games will tip off on Thursday. They have 4 games scheduled out in Las Vegas. I will be there attending and covering. But first thoughts on the roster, reaction to it. There weren't too many surprises. I think it was really great to see that all 5 of the Nets' first-round picks will be playing. So Yegor Demon, Nolan Traore, Drake Powell, Ben Surratt, Danny Wolf, all those guys will be out there and sharing the floor together, which will be really interesting to see. I'm going to get into that a little bit later, how that could potentially play out. But of the major surprises, I think there was only one. I think no Dariq Whitehead. He will not be playing. None of the Nets' third-year players will be playing those draft picks from 2023. Noah Clowney, Dariq Whitehead, and Jalen Wilson. None of them will be taking the floor. And I don't really think that was surprising in Clowney and Jalen Wilson's case. You know, Clowney, a guy who got minutes during his first 2 seasons in the NBA, really played a feature role in the Nets rotation last season, as did Jalen Wilson. Wilson won Summer League MVP last year. So not surprising to not see those guys playing. And in Whitehead's case, you could say it's not surprising because the Nets typically don't play third-year players at Summer League. You look at all their first-round picks or just draft picks in general over the years. None of them play into that third year at Summer League. It's usually just the first 2 seasons. You look at Nick Claxton didn't do that, Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, whoever you want to name, they don't play that third year. But in Dariq Whitehead's case, he's obviously a unique example of this because he's a guy who hasn't played much basketball up to this point in his NBA career. He's entering his 3rd season. Obviously, had the injury-riddled college freshman year at Duke, dealing with those foot injuries, those knee injuries. And then he comes into the NBA and he doesn't really play during his rookie season. And last season, he got more run. But still, over the first couple of years, he's only played in 68 total games in his first 2 NBA seasons. That's between the G League and the NBA. And he's a guy that really struggled last season at Summer League. I think we all, saw how that played out, and then got into this season and had some encouraging moments in the G League and when he got called up late in the year to the Nets in the NBA, but still obviously is pretty unsure of himself with the ball in his hands. As a guy who really needs to just get more reps to try to, get his, physicality, get his athleticism in order, also get his decision-making and his ball handling, all that stuff. It's just, he's extremely raw entering his 3rd NBA season. And I thought that this would be, another opportunity for him to potentially get more minutes, play against, some higher talent, have some, ability to reacclimate his body and his mind to, making decisions on the floor. But at the same time, the Nets did just bring in 5 first-round picks. They have other guys who are going to be playing from last year's roster. They brought in some guys, undrafted guys who are going to, potentially get some time. So it could have been a thing where there might just not be enough minutes to go around on this team. There's so many guys who are going to need to play. There's so many guys who are going to be, headliners to this Summer League roster that if you throw a third-year player like Dariq Whitehead in the mix, it might be tough to get him minutes. But I do think it was surprising, somewhat surprising that Dariq wasn't on this roster and that he's not going to be playing here. But, maybe they think it's better for him to just be training with his team, with the team and, with his own people and just, getting his body right and getting ready for this coming season, not out in Las Vegas. So somewhat surprising, but, not shocking, I would say. Just, thought maybe he would be on there. But now talking about what I think fans should be watching for, in this Summer League in Las Vegas for the Nets, the 5 first-round picks, obviously, are going to headline this. And Yegor Demon specifically, the player that the Nets took at 8th overall, and a lot of people, were shocked by it. A lot of people labeled it a massive reach. And this is going to be his first time, obviously, taking the floor as a professional. And there's going to be a lot of things that fans should be watching out for. The biggest for me, there's two things. Obviously, the outside shot. We've talked about that. I've talked about that ad nauseum, how important that's going to be to unlocking his game as a pick and roll ball handler and also his ability to play off the ball. So that goes without saying. The outside shot's going to be big. He struggled at BYU. He apparently shot it exceptionally well with the Nets at their workouts with him and also during his pro day. And we got some really confident comments from Sean Marks and Jordi Fernandez after the draft. Jordi Fernandez in the introductory press conference for these rookies flat out said his shooting was part of what attracted us. He's going to shoot the ball well as an NBA player. So there's no lack of conviction from the Nets about what Demon's shooting capabilities are going to be. So that'll be something to watch. But also, you hear the knocks on Demon coming out of the draft. It's the lack of athleticism, the lack of ball handling capabilities, the lack of shake to be able to create separation off the dribble. How does he respond to the athleticism of these defenders at Summer League? Like, these are no way, stud NBA players that are out there. There'll be some of those guys, but obviously the majority of these guys are NBA roster hopefuls. But it's still a step up in terms of athleticism, physicality, and all that stuff to what he saw at BYU. And he did struggle for a decent portion of the season with that at BYU. So how does he respond to that as a ball handler? How is he able to handle the ball, control the offense, play with tempo as a pick and roll ball handler, also as a guy, just in other sets, and how can he handle that? That's going to be something that Nets fans should definitely be watching out for. And then also just the position. How are the Nets utilizing him? This team is going to be coached by at Summer League Steve Hetzel, one of the Nets' lead assistants, a really trusted guy under Jordi Fernandez. So obviously, it's different playing Summer League from what you're going to see in NBA games, but there is obviously a coaching staff presence there that Jordi knows what he wants. He's with these guys practicing, and Hetzel's going to be coaching it. So how are they using these guys positionally, particularly Demon, but it really extends to the entire rookie class, because a big criticism of this draft class for the Nets, they used all 5 of the first-round picks. That shocked everybody, but also them taking 3 international point guards in Yegor Demon, Nolan Traore, Ben Saraf. A lot of people thought there was a lot of overlap in those skill sets. And when we asked Sean Marks and Jordi Fernandez about it, they both said that they feel that this is a very versatile class. All these players have really good size and measurables. They think that, athletically, they'll be able to hang, with NBA type talent. So how are they using all these guys positionally? Because it'll be interesting to see, Yegor Demon, he's been labeled as a point guard, but I talked to some draft analysts on my show who said, I just had Derek Parker on the show. He said he sees him more as a wing long-term in the NBA. So how are they using Demon offensively? Is he playing alongside Traore? How do those two kind of fit together in tandem? Also, Ben Saraf, obviously another ball handler who's going to enter the mix. So it'll be really interesting to see positionally how all those guys fit together. So, how much is Demon on the ball versus off the ball? Where do Traore and Saraf fit into that equation? That'll be really interesting to see. You also have, Drake Powell, a guy who's not a ball handler and is a little bit more of a clean fit because he's just a 3-and-D wing. But I outlined it on my show yesterday, a guy who's an elite defender. His defensive capabilities really stick out. A lot of people think he's the best athlete in this year's draft class. So he has that. He shot the ball well on low volume. So can he continue to keep shooting it well? And then I outlined yesterday the usage rate was just historically low for a wing player drafted, where he was or just drafted at all. So is he able to do some more things in the ball and with the ball in his hands? How does he look? Does he look comfortable in those spots? Potentially attacking closeouts, maybe even doing some things from a self-creation standpoint. So that'll be interesting to see. And then the last guy, Danny Wolf, he's just going to be a lot of fun. He's another guy positionally. He could play center. He could play power forward. He played a little bit of a point forward at Michigan. So he's a guy who can be used in various ways. How does he match up defensively against these teams? How is he guarding centers? How is he guarding some quicker guys, quicker fours, potentially even switched onto some wings? How does he hold up there? Where does he factor in to the pick and roll ball handling conversation? That's obviously a main skill that he had at Michigan, but we have these guys with Demon, Traore, Saraf, other guys that the Nets have on this Summer League roster who I'll get into in a little bit. There's just a lot of ball handling. So how does Danny Wolf fit into that? And then how does he also look, as a floor spacer, potential, short roll playmaker and all those things? Just a lot of different ways that they can use him. There's a lot of ways that all of these pieces can fit together positionally. And there's a lot of, strengths and weaknesses that, were major question marks for draft analysts coming out who were evaluating this Nets draft class. So how do those things look at the Summer League? We're going to get a look at all 5 of these guys individually and on the floor together. So it'll be really fun to see, how they all fit in together and, what their, first action as professionals as Nets players alongside one another looks like. So all things that Nets fans should be excited to watch, and I'm really excited to cover out in Las Vegas. But there are more players on this Summer League roster outside of the draft picks who could have some implications for Brooklyn's roster moving forward. So who are they and how can the Nets approach that? I'll get into that after a quick break. But before that, want to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not making it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. Guys, you can use FanDuel to track your favorite matchups, and the app keeps it fresh with new daily promotions and fun ways to bet. It's easy to use, fast to pay out, and makes even regular season games feel like must-watch events. New to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Coming out of the break on today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the Summer League, the Nets roster, and some of the players who could play a significant role. I just touched on the 5 first-round picks. We're obviously going to headline the action, but there are other contributors from last year's Nets team, in the NBA who are going to be getting time at Summer League this year. 3 guys who played last season, played some significant minutes throughout the year for the Nets are Tosan Uwoman, Tyson Etienne, and Drew Timme. All of those guys are going to be with the Nets Summer League team this year. Uwoman and Etienne are on 2-way contracts, while Drew Timme is on a non-guaranteed standard deal. And I think it's going to be intriguing for all 3 of these guys. Their performance at Summer League, I think, will be significant. Especially in Timmy's case, because Timme is the guy who's on a non-guaranteed standard deal. So there's a little bit more question about, where he's going to fit into the roster this coming season and whether he's even going to be on the roster. And you look at the Nets roster, they have 16 players on standard contracts right now. And that's going to be going up to 17 if they re-sign Cam Thomas, which the expectation is that they will. So 17 guys on standard contracts. You're only allowed 15, in the NBA. So there's going to be some guys who are odd men out, and there's going to be a lot of competition for these 2-way spots. That you get in this new CBA, you get 3 2-way spots, and that's already have 2 players on 2-way contracts in Uwoman and Etienne. But there's guys who are on standard deals, non or partially guaranteed, or non-guaranteed in all of these guys' cases, standard deals who could be cut and are eligible for 2-way contracts. You look at guys like Drew Timme and Tyrese Martin. They're eligible for 2-way contracts if they're waived by the Nets because they have under 4 years of NBA service under their belt. So there's going to be a lot of competition for these 2-way spots, and which one of these guys come away with it. It's going to be really interesting because even though Uwoman and Etienne are on 2-way contracts, they can be waived. Like, these 2-way contracts don't fully guarantee until I think January 7th or January 10th, I'm pretty sure is the date. So up until then, you see a lot of roster shuffling with the 2-way guys from NBA teams. Like last year, we saw some guys brought in by the Nets on 2-way deals and then cut shortly thereafter. Then new guys brought in. So just because you're on a 2-way contract like Uwoman and Etienne are, you're no way guaranteed that spot for the rest of the season. It's not, it's not a guaranteed contract in that way. So with Drew Timme, with Tyrese Martin being eligible for 2-way contracts if they are waived, there is going to be some competition there. And all of these players bring different things to the table that I think are really intriguing for the Nets. If you're talking about Uwoman and Etienne as the 2 guys on the 2-way contracts right now, Uwoman plays, a really funky style of offensive ball. He's a guy who can do some things off the dribble. He can do some things as a scorer in the mid-range, as a decision maker sometimes. And I think the 3-point shot hasn't come around up to this point, but there could be some potential there. They could think that he's going to improve as a shooter. And if he can improve there, along with some of the things he can do as a scorer on the ball, and also some of the defensive capabilities he has as a guy who, is pretty athletic and has some measurables there that are, working in his favor in terms of wingspan, athleticism, fluidity, mobility, all of that. He could be interesting. And I think he's a player who the Nets liked what they saw last season. So he's a guy who a 2-way spot, I think it makes sense for him. You have Tyson Etienne, a smaller guard, who, struggled when he came up with the Nets last season, but in the G League last year was one of the top 3-point shooters in the G League. Shot, I think it was around like 45% on 6 or 7 attempts per game. So really elite there. I think the Nets like what they saw there from his buy-in late in the season. And then you have, Drew Timme, a guy who is obviously a fan favorite. going back to his college days, his NCAA tournament success there with Gonzaga, played last season and really performed well. Like we saw a game late in the year where Drew Timme went head to head with Anthony Davis in Dallas and really outplayed him in the fourth quarter. And I think there's obvious reasons why Timme went undrafted after being a college star. You look at his, player archetype as a center who's grounded. He's not a rim protector. He doesn't shoot the ball well from three up to this point in his career. He shot it really well with Long Island, but hasn't shot the ball well. When he got called up with the Nets, he struggled from three. But a guy who's a really smart player, a guy who can do some interesting things as a post scorer and with the ball in his hands as a decision maker. A guy who's just a really high IQ, high feel guy. And I know that's something that the Nets are putting a priority on, based on what you look at the guys that they drafted this year. Those were a lot of the buzzwords, high IQ, high feel, unselfish. Drew Timme checks a lot of those boxes. And while, the rim protection isn't there, the three-point shooting hasn't been there up to this point. If he can develop into a floor spacer to complement some of that stuff, it's not out of the question that he could be a guy who could, stick in the NBA or at least have a roster spot, for a few years into the foreseeable future. So Drew Timme, another interesting guy. It's Tyrese Martin, also going to be eligible for a two-way contract if he's waived, which he could very well secure a standard roster spot. I wouldn't be surprised. There's just a lot of competition there, as I outlined, with 17 guys on standard deals right now. And, if they re-sign Cam Thomas, 17, and there only being 15 that are allowed on a roster. But Tyrese Martin shot the ball really well last season, had a career best shooting year, was at like 35%, I think, on, pretty high volume. Had that one game in Phoenix where he hit 9 threes or whatever that was. Also a guy who I was surprised by what he was able to do with the ball in his hands in terms of being a pick and roll ball handler, being a guy who could get to the cup there, and also being a facilitator. Had a little bit more passing and playmaking chops in the pick and roll than I expected. So he's another guy who I think is interested. And if the Nets were to waive him, I definitely think he'd be a prime candidate to be back on a two-way contract. Probably, definitely I would say the most promising player of this group amongst the guys, when you're evaluating what they did last season. So there's going to be competition for these two-way spots. You have three guys in Timme, Woman, and ETN who are going to be getting minutes at this year's Summer League. And I think their play, will tell you something about, what it could look like moving forward if they are to struggle or whether or not they're able to ball out, because they are older guys. You look at, Timme, ETN, and Woman are all in that 24 to 25 range. Also Tyrese Martin in that age range. So all these guys are in, similar age ranges, bring similar things or similar and different things to the table, as fringe roster guys. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how they play because there's going to be a lot of competition. There's also two more players on this Summer League roster who could factor into that two-way equation. Who are they? I'll answer that after a quick break. Coming out of the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the Nets Summer League roster and potentially some competition for two-way and back-end roster spots. I just touched on, the Nets guys who are going to be playing at Summer League who were on the team last season and will be competing or have or could be, in competition for two-way contracts in training camp and leading into the regular season. That was Tosan Woman, Tyson Etienne, Drew Timme. Also, Tyrese Martin, not going to be playing at Summer League, but a guy who would be eligible for a two-way if he got waived from his non-guaranteed standard deal. But there's two more guys who were added to the Nets Summer League roster I think could factor into that two-way conversation, and that is Quincy Olivari and Grant Nelson. Going to start with Olivari, a guy who spent last season on a two-way deal with the Lakers after going undrafted out of Xavier. He's a 6'3" point guard, 24 years old. Went undrafted out of Xavier, then signed an Exhibit 10 with the Lakers, played really well at training camp, and they gave him a two-way deal. Only appeared in 2 games in the NBA last season, but played pretty well in the G League. You look at what he did with the South Bay Lakers, averaged 18, 5, and 5 on 40, 34, 78 shooting splits last season over like 34 or 35 appearances, something like that. So a guy who I think has some intriguing tools. I got to watch him play a little bit at Xavier. I didn't see him as much last season because he was in the G League most of the year, but things I've read about him, a quicker point guard, has some ball handling ability, has some 3-level scoring capabilities. So we'll see. The Lakers saw something in him last year and gave him that two-way deal. Obviously, they don't bring him back. But, if you look at him, you look at Tyson Etienne, there's guys who could be some competition there for potential point guard spot in the backcourt. And next guy, I said Grant Nelson. I think if you're someone who followed college basketball these past couple seasons, especially last season, you would know who Grant Nelson is. Obviously starred at Alabama the last 2 seasons. Before that, spent 3 years at North Dakota State. He's a 6'10" forward. He went undrafted, but signed an Exhibit 10 contract with the Nets, which is pretty much a training camp, non-guaranteed training camp deal, training camp invite. But a really versatile player who I think has some intriguing tools. I got to watch him at the Prudential Center in the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament. They played against Yegor Demin and BYU in that game. And a guy who has some just intriguing tools. He's really versatile at 6'10", a really fluid mover, a guy who can handle the ball a little bit, can do some things off the dribble. Also, you can use him in screening sets, a little bit of short roll playmaking ability. Really struggled shooting the ball at Alabama, and he's already 23 years old, played 5 college seasons. So those are obviously some of the drawbacks there. But a versatile player where if the shot can come around, he has some ball handling ability, he has some things he can do on and off the ball at 6'10" with incredible size there in the front court. Defensively has some capabilities there, like isn't an unbelievable athlete by any stretch in terms of leaping or lateral quickness or anything of that, but I think has the fluid mobility to be able to stay with some guys and protect the rim just using his height and, length and all that. So I think an interesting player, a guy who I think could be another candidate for a two-way contract. Like if we're looking at these two-way guys on the back end of the roster, you have Iwoma, Etienne, Timmy, potentially Tyrese Martin. Now you add Olivari and Grant Nelson. 5 of those 6 guys are going to be playing for the Nets at Summer League. And Nelson, a guy who I think, while he played 5 college seasons, had the most college pedigree. Like you look at what he did last season at Alabama, and he really was, he replaced Noah Clowney there when Noah Clowney left, and he really was an effective replacement. And I don't think people would call him a star, but he was definitely one of the more notable players who was on that Alabama squad that, went to the Elite Eight and played really well there. So I definitely think that he's a guy who could factor into the two-way conversation depending on what he does at Summer League and also, how he looks going into training camp. But there's a lot of roster uncertainty on the back end of this Nets roster right now. And I think there's going to be a lot of headlines, obviously, about the 5 draft picks playing at Summer League. But all of these other guys, I think, will be interesting to watch and see how they play, and how they kind of fit in with the new guys and the new roster the Nets brought in. So a lot of exciting developments for the Nets there at Summer League. I think fans are going to be really excited to see how all these pieces fit together and how Steve Hetzel and Nets coaching staff, if there are any hints of how they're envisioning, utilizing some of these players, especially guys like Yegor Demin, Nolan Troy, Danny Wolf, how some of these guys fit into the puzzle. So really exciting, and I'm going to have coverage of all that out there in Las Vegas. But that does it for this episode of Locked On Nets. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. If you do not already, go to YouTube and subscribe. Also subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Be sure to like, comment on this content if you enjoyed it. Anything you can do to engage is much appreciated. Let me know what you think about the Nets Summer League roster. Let me know what you think about Dariq Whitehead not playing. Let me know what you're most excited to see amongst the draft pick and some of the back end roster guys that I laid out. But heading out to Las Vegas here soon to cover all of that. But I'll have that on Clutch Points with my writing and here on Locked On Nets, where I'll be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.